The heavy, suffocating silence in the first-class cabin was shattered by the sharp sound of tearing fabric. Two broad-shouldered airport security officers had a physical grip on 17-year-old Cleo Mitchell, their knuckles white as they twisted her arms backward, determined to rip her from her paid window seat. Other passengers gasped, a few lifting their phones to record, but no one intervened as the lead officer sneered, "Stop resisting, or you're going out in cuffs." Cleo's heart hammered violently against her ribs, but she didn't scream. Instead, with her one free, trembling hand, she pressed the speed dial button on her phone. It was the direct line to her father, a man who practically owned the sky they were about to fly in. The chaotic hum of John F. Kennedy International Airport's Terminal 4 was a symphony of rolling suitcases, garbled overhead announcements, and the frantic energy of thousands of travelers rushing to their destinations. Outside, the early evening sky was bruised with dark, heavy rain clouds, but inside the gleaming glass-walled concourse, the atmosphere was strictly climate-controlled and brilliantly lit. Parked at Gate B32 was a massive Boeing 777-300ER, its silver fuselage reflecting the harsh tarmac lights as it prepared for the red-eye transatlantic journey to London Heathrow. 17-year-old Cleo Mitchell sat quietly in Seat 2A, nestled deep within the luxurious private confines of the international first-class cabin. She was a picture of understated comfort, dressed in oversized grey sweatpants, crisp white sneakers, and an oversized black hoodie that swallowed her slender frame. A pair of silver noise-cancelling headphones rested over her ears, drowning out the ambient noise of the boarding process. She had her long dark braids pulled up into a loose bun, and her attention was entirely focused on the thick hardcover novel resting on her tray table. Beside her feet sat a sleek, matte black Rimowa carry-on, perfectly stowed according to FAA regulations. To anyone else, Cleo looked like just another teenager trying to survive a long-haul flight. But Cleo was not just any teenager. She was the only daughter of Rhett Mitchell, the fiercely private and notoriously ruthless founder of Mitchell Capital, a Manhattan-based private equity behemoth that managed over $400 billion in assets worldwide. Rhett was a man who moved markets with a whisper, and among his firm's most recent unpublicized acquisitions was a controlling 30% stake in the parent company of the very airline Cleo was currently flying on. Cleo, however, despised flaunting her wealth. She preferred flying under the radar, traveling without her father's usual detail of private security whenever she could convince him to let her breathe, relying instead on the simple anonymity of a crowded commercial flight, albeit in a lie-flat seat. The tranquility of the first-class cabin shifted the moment Beatrice Montgomery stepped through the aircraft doors. Beatrice was a woman who practically radiated old money entitlement. In her late 60s, draped in a tailored Chanel tweed blazer and dripping in heavy, ostentatious pearls, she carried herself with a rigid, arrogant posture that demanded immediate deference. She marched down the aisle, her sharp eyes scanning the cabin to assess her temporary neighbors for the next 7 hours. Her gaze landed on Seat 2A. Beatrice stopped dead in her tracks, her perfectly manicured eyebrows knitted together in a severe frown. She looked at the young black teenager lounging comfortably in the plush leather seat, wearing a baggy hoodie, and then looked at her own boarding pass. Beatrice was assigned Seat 2B, the aisle seat directly next to Cleo. Instead of taking her seat, Beatrice stood in the aisle, blocking the flow of the few other premium passengers boarding behind her. She let out a loud, theatrical sigh designed to draw attention. When Cleo didn't look up from her book, Beatrice leaned over and sharply tapped the plastic shell of Cleo's television monitor with a long acrylic fingernail. Cleo blinked, paused her music, and pulled one side of her headphones back. "Excuse me?" she said politely, her voice soft and even. "I believe you are in the wrong cabin, young lady," Beatrice announced, her voice projecting loud enough for the entire section to hear. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation laced with undeniable condescension. "Economy boarding hasn't even begun yet. You need to gather your things and head to the back before you hold up the flight." Cleo stared at the woman, a flicker of genuine confusion crossing her face before realization settled in. She had dealt with microaggressions her entire life growing up in elite Upper East Side prep schools, but the blatant, naked audacity of this stranger was startling. I'm in the correct seat, Cleo replied calmly, keeping her tone completely neutral. She had learned early on from her father that emotion was a liability when dealing with unreasonable people. Seat 2A, Beatrice scoffed, a short, bitter sound that rattled in her throat. Impossible. These seats are upwards of $8,000. I highly doubt your parents purchased a first-class ticket for a teenager in sweatpants. Now move along before I have to call a flight attendant. You are welcome to check with the crew if you're confused, Cleo said, sliding her headphone back over her ear and turning her eyes back to her book. She had no intention of arguing with a woman who had already made up her mind based purely on the color of her skin and the casualness of her clothes. The dismissal infuriated Beatrice, her face flushed a deep, mottled red. "Excuse me," she barked, turning swiftly toward the front galley. Miss, I need assistance immediately." Susan Higgins, a senior flight attendant with 20 years of experience and a rigidly sprayed blonde bob, rushed out from behind the galley curtain. Susan prided herself on maintaining order and catering to the high-paying clientele of the premium cabins. She took one look at Beatrice's distressed, wealthy appearance and immediately went into damage control mode. "Mrs. Montgomery, welcome back," Susan said, recognizing the frequent flyer. "Is there a problem with your seat?" "There is a massive problem," Beatrice hissed, pointing a trembling, ring-covered finger directly at Cleo. "This girl is squatting in the window seat. She refuses to move to economy, and she is being incredibly hostile. I will not sit next to someone who has sneaked into the first-class cabin. It is completely unacceptable, and frankly, I feel unsafe." Susan's expression hardened. She didn't bother to check the manifest on her tablet. She simply looked at Cleo, taking in the young black girl in the hoodie, and made the exact same prejudiced calculation Beatrice had just made. "I'll handle this, Mrs. Montgomery," Susan said with a reassuring, tight-lipped smile. She approached seat 2A, her posture stiffening into a stance of pure authority. "Miss, I'm going to need you to pack up your bag and step out of the seat right now." Cleo slowly lowered her book. The ambient noise of the cabin seemed to dial down, replaced by a thick, uncomfortable tension. Across the aisle, a middle-aged businessman named David Cole peered over the top of his Wall Street Journal, his brow furrowed in concern, watching the interaction unfold. "I'm sorry," Cleo said, her voice steady but carrying a new, sharper edge. "Why am I being asked to pack my bag?" "Because you are in a first-class seat," Susan said, speaking slowly and loudly, as if addressing a child who didn't understand English. "This area is strictly reserved for ticketed premium passengers. Economy is through those curtains and to the back. If you do not move voluntarily, I will have to report you to the captain." Cleo reached into the pocket of her hoodie, retrieved her phone, and pulled up her digital boarding pass. She held the screen up so the brightness illuminated Susan's face. The screen clearly displayed her name. Mitchell, Cleo. Seat 2A. Class, first. "Here is my boarding pass," Cleo stated, holding the phone steady. "As I told the woman next to you, I am in the right seat." Susan blinked, staring at the screen. For a split second, a flash of uncertainty crossed her eyes, but it was quickly swallowed by a wave of stubborn pride. To admit she was wrong in front of Beatrice, Montgomery would be humiliating. Instead of apologizing, Susan's mind raced for an excuse to maintain her authority. "Boarding passes can be screenshotted or altered," Susan deflected, waving her hand dismissively at the phone. "Our internal manifest does not show a teenager in this seat. We have a very strict protocol." "Then check your internal manifest," Cleo challenged, her eyes locking onto Susan's. "Pull up your tablet and read the name for 2A. Beatrice, hovering right behind Susan, let out an indignant huff. "This is absurd. Susan, I demand she be removed. My husband was supposed to fly with me tonight, and I wanted him in that seat. Even if she has a ticket, she is a minor traveling alone, acting aggressively and making me profoundly uncomfortable." Susan seized the lifeline Beatrice had just thrown her. "Actually, miss," Susan said, her voice dropping an octave, taking on a cold, corporate tone, "we are experiencing a weight distribution issue on this aircraft, and we need to shuffle some passengers. Furthermore, we have a VIP flyer who requires this specific seat due to a ticketing error at the gate. I am officially reassigning you to seat 42J. It is a middle seat in the rear of the aircraft. but we will compensate you with a voucher." David Cole, watching from across the aisle, couldn't stay silent anymore. "Are you kidding me?" he muttered, leaning forward. "A weight distribution issue on a fully loaded Boeing 777. A 100-pound girl moving to the back isn't going to fix the center of gravity, and you know it. Leave the kid alone." "Sir, please do not interfere with flight crew operations," Susan snapped, glaring at David before turning her full, imposing presence back onto Cleo. "Miss, I am giving you a direct, lawful order from the flight crew. You must vacate this seat immediately, or you will be in violation of federal aviation regulations." Cleo felt a hot spike of anger in her chest, but she forcefully pushed it down. She remembered her father's advice from boardrooms. When they raise their voices, you lower yours. When they break the rules, you document everything. "I am not moving," Cleo said, her voice dropping to a near whisper that nonetheless carried clearly through the hushed cabin. "I paid for this seat. I am not violating any rules. You are fabricating a weight issue because this woman," Cleo pointed at Beatrice, "doesn't want to sit next to a black teenager. That is a violation of the airline's non-discrimination policy, and it is a breach of contract." The word black seemed to echo in the cabin. Beatrice gasped, dramatically pressing a hand to her chest. "How dare you play the race card? You are a deeply disrespectful, unruly child." "Unruly," Susan repeated, the word rolling off her tongue like a weapon she had been waiting to unsheathe. In the aviation industry, unruly was the magic password. It was the word that stripped a passenger of their rights and gave the crew absolute power. "You are refusing a direct crew member instruction. You are raising your voice. You are acting in a threatening manner toward other passengers." "I am sitting down," Cleo stated, her hands visibly resting flat on her tray table. "I haven't moved an inch." "I am going to ask you one last time," Susan said, her face flushed with a mix of adrenaline and fury. "Get out of the seat." "No," Cleo replied. Susan turned on her heel and marched straight back to the galley, violently pulling the curtain shut behind her. Beatrice stood in the aisle, glaring triumphantly down at Cleo. "You've really done it now, little girl. They are going to drag you off this plane, and you'll end up on a no-fly list for the rest of your miserable life." Cleo didn't respond. She picked up her phone and unlocked the screen. She didn't call her dad immediately. She knew he was in a massive merger meeting in Tokyo, 12 hours ahead. She only ever used the emergency bypass number for life-or-death situations. Instead, she quietly opened her camera app, setting it to record audio and video, resting it discreetly against the window frame, the lens pointed directly at the aisle. 5 minutes passed. The heavy rain began to lash against the small oval window. The captain's voice crackled over the PA system. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a minor security situation we need to resolve before pushing back. We apologize for the delay and should be underway shortly." A low murmur rippled through the economy cabin behind them. Up front, the tension was thick enough to choke on. David Cole gave Cleo a sympathetic, worried look. "Hey," he whispered across the aisle, "you want me to film this too? I saw the whole thing. It's pure profiling." "Thank you," Cleo whispered back, her voice tight. "I'd appreciate that." The heavy thud of combat boots, stomping down the jet bridge, echoed through the open cabin door. The galley curtains were ripped open, and 3 airport security officers marched into the first-class cabin. They were dressed in dark tactical uniforms, heavy duty belts loaded with radios, cuffs, and batons. They were not NYPD, they were contracted airport security, heavily militarized, and historically poorly trained in de-escalation. Leading the pack was Officer Greg Daniels, a burly, red-faced man with a thick neck and a permanent scowl. He lived for these moments, the power trips, the authority, the unquestioned compliance he felt his badge demanded. Susan, the flight attendant, flanked him, pointing a shaking finger at Cleo. "That's her. She has violently refused to follow crew instructions. She threatened a VIP passenger, and she is causing a severe disruption. The captain wants her off the aircraft immediately." Daniels didn't hesitate. He didn't ask for Cleo's side of the story. He didn't ask to see her boarding pass. He simply marched down the aisle, his massive frame blocking out the overhead lights, casting a dark shadow over Cleo. "All right, party's over," Daniels barked, his voice booming through the cabin. "Grab your bags. You're getting off this plane." Cleo looked up at the towering officer. Her hands were starting to shake, a natural physiological response to the imposing threat standing over her, but her jaw was set in pure defiance. "Officer," Cleo began, speaking clearly into the phone camera still resting on the window, "I am a ticketed passenger in my assigned seat. I have committed no crime. I have caused no disturbance. I am being targeted due to racial profiling by that passenger and the flight crew." "I don't care about your excuses," Daniels snapped, stepping closer, his heavy belt scraping against the armrest of Beatrice's empty seat. "The captain said you're a security risk. That means you are trespassing on this aircraft. Get up now, or I will physically remove you." "Are you serious?" David Cole yelled, standing up from his seat. "She's a kid. She hasn't done anything wrong. The flight attendant made up a lie because the lady in 2B didn't want to sit next to her." "Sit down and shut up, sir, or you're going to jail too," Daniels roared, pointing a thick finger at David. Another officer stepped forward, putting a hand on his baton, effectively forcing David to back down into his seat, though David kept his phone raised, recording every second. Daniels turned his full, hostile attention back to Cleo. "This is your final warning. Stand up." "I need your name and badge number," Cleo said, her voice wavering slightly, but her gaze remaining locked on his. "If you touch me, it is assault. I am not posing a threat." "You asked for it," Daniels growled. He lunged forward. The cabin erupted into gasps and shouts. Daniels' large, rough hands clamped down on Cleo's left wrist and shoulder. His grip was entirely disproportionate to the situation, fingers digging brutally into her skin, crushing the soft fabric of her hoodie. "Stop, you're hurting me," Cleo cried out, the sudden shock of the physical violence breaking her calm facade. "Stop resisting," Daniels bellowed, a standard trained phrase designed to legally cover his own aggression. He yanked her violently toward the aisle. The seatbelt, which Cleo had loosely fastened, caught her waist, snapping her back against the seat. "Get the belt! Get the belt!" Daniels shouted to his partner, a younger officer who looked pale and hesitant but reached over anyway, fumbling to unclick the metal buckle. Cleo felt a terrifying sense of helplessness wash over her. They were going to drag her out, humiliating her, potentially injuring her, all because she dared to exist in a space they deemed off-limits to her. As the second officer successfully unlatched the belt, Daniels braced his boots against the floorboards, preparing to heave Cleo out of the seat and drag her backward down the aisle by her arms. In that frantic, terrifying split second, Cleo stopped trying to pull her arm back. Instead, she lunged forward with her free right hand, grabbing her phone from the window ledge. Her thumb smashed against the side button 3 times in rapid succession. Emergency SOS. It bypassed all Do Not Disturb settings. It bypassed the international dial tones. It sent a live GPS ping and instantly initiated a call to the only contact on the priority list. The phone fell from her grasp, tumbling onto the floorboard near Daniel's heavy boots, but the call had already connected. The screen lit up, switching automatically to speakerphone mode just as Daniels yanked Cleo entirely out of her seat, throwing her off balance into the narrow aisle. A sharp, commanding voice, distorted slightly by the phone's speaker but unmistakable in its icy authority, sliced through the chaos of the cabin. "Cleo, what is happening? Speak to me." It was Rhett Mitchell. The distorted, commanding voice of Rhett Mitchell echoed from the dropped iPhone, temporarily freezing the violent, kinetic energy in the first-class aisle. Even through the tiny speaker resting on the carpeted floorboard, the sheer authority in his tone was unmistakable. Officer Greg Daniels paused, his heavy boots bracketing the device. He looked down, his brow furrowing in irritation. "Who is this?" Daniels barked, his grip on Cleo's arm loosening just a fraction, though still painfully tight. "This is Rhett Mitchell," the voice replied, the icy calm in his tone sharper than a scalpel. "You have exactly 3 seconds to take your hands off my daughter before I personally ensure you are federally indicted for the assault of a minor. State your name, your contractor ID, and the badge number of the officer assisting you. Now." For a microsecond, doubt flickered in Susan's eyes. Working in international first class out of JFK Terminal 4, she had encountered her fair share of powerful people. The name Mitchell rang a faint warning bell in the back of her mind, but before her brain could connect the dots to Mitchell Capital, the private equity firm that had recently restructured the airline's holding company, Daniels snorted in derision. He was a man completely blinded by his own unchecked authority. "I don't care if you're the President of the United States, buddy," Daniels sneered, his face flushing with arrogant defiance. "Your kid is an unruly passenger, she's trespassing, and she's resisting lawful orders. I'm Officer Daniels, badge 4409. You can call customer service and file a complaint." Without breaking eye contact with Cleo, Daniels lifted his heavy tactical boot and brought it down hard on the iPhone. The screen shattered with a sickening crunch, the glass spiderwebbing instantly. The line went dead, cutting off whatever Rhett Mitchell was about to say next. Cleo gasped, not just at the destruction of her phone, but at the chilling realization that her only lifeline had just been severed. "Let's go," Daniels grunted, signaling to his paler, younger partner. Together, they yanked Cleo roughly by her shoulders, practically dragging her backward. Her sneakers scrambled against the plush carpet as she was forced past the galley, through the aircraft door, and out onto the cold industrial floor of the jet bridge. Inside the cabin, the immediate aftermath was a stark, disturbing contrast. As the heavy aircraft door was pulled partially shut, sealing off the sound of the altercation, Beatrice Montgomery exhaled a loud theatrical sigh of relief. She smoothed the wrinkles from her Chanel tweed blazer and elegantly slid into seat 2A, Cleo's seat. "Finally," Beatrice murmured, adjusting the air vent above her. She looked up at Susan, offering a conspiratorial, triumphant smile. "Good riddance. You handled that beautifully, Susan. Honestly, the absolute nerve of some people today. Could I bother you for a pre-departure glass of Dom Perignon? My nerves are completely frayed." "Right away, Mrs. Montgomery," Susan replied, her professional smile instantly returning, completely burying any lingering anxiety. "We apologize for the disturbance. We'll have you in the air shortly." Across the aisle, David Cole remained standing, his face pale with fury. His smartphone was still raised, having recorded the entire brutal encounter. "You people are monsters," David said, his voice trembling with a mix of rage and disbelief. "She was a child. She had a ticket. I have the whole thing on video." Susan turned to him, her smile dropping into a flat corporate line. "Sir, I strongly advise you to take your seat and lower your device. Federal regulations prohibit interfering with flight crew duties. If you continue to cause a disruption, we will have security return and remove you as well." David locked eyes with her, the silence stretching taut. He knew he was outnumbered and that getting kicked off wouldn't help the girl now. Slowly, he lowered his phone and sat down, but he immediately opened his email app. Typing out a message to his firm's legal department, attaching the massive video file, he wasn't going to let this go. Meanwhile, up in the cockpit, Captain Miller was oblivious to the specific details of the altercation. He had only been told by the head flight attendant that an unruly squatter was refusing to leave a premium seat and causing a security risk. Trusting his crew, he had authorized the removal. Now he was focused on making up for lost time. "JFK ground, this is Global Atlantic Flight 412, heavy," the captain spoke into his headset. "Clearance for pushback, gate B32. "Global Atlantic 412, ground. Stand by," the air traffic controller replied. There was an unusual pause on the frequency. Captain Miller frowned. The weather was clearing, and their slot in the departure queue was rapidly approaching. "Ground 412. We are fully loaded and ready. Standing by." 2 minutes passed. The heavy pushback tug connected to the front landing gear of the Boeing 777. The ground crew chief signaled that the pins were removed. Everything was green. Then the radio crackled again, but the voice wasn't the standard ground controller. It was the heavy, authoritative tone of the JFK Tower supervisor. "Global Atlantic Flight 412, this is JFK Tower. Your pushback clearance is officially revoked. I repeat, clearance revoked. Issue a full ground stop for your aircraft immediately. Kill your engines if they are spooled. You are ordered to hold your position." Captain Miller exchanged a bewildered look with his first officer. "Tower, 412, please confirm. We have a green light across the board. Is there a mechanical issue?" "Negative, 412, the tower supervisor replied, his voice tight. "By direct order of the Port Authority Police Department and the Federal Aviation Administration, your aircraft is grounded. Do not attempt to detach the jet bridge. Heavily armed units are currently breaching Terminal 4. Heading to your gate. Await further instructions. While Officer Daniels and his partner held Cleo against the cold, corrugated metal wall of the jet bridge, aggressively patting down her pockets for weapons, they were completely unaware that the world outside their tiny corridor had just exploded. When Rhett Mitchell's call was abruptly disconnected, he didn't panic. Panic was an emotion he had trained out of his system decades ago. Sitting in a high-rise boardroom overlooking the neon-lit skyline of Tokyo, he simply raised a hand, silencing the 12 executives pitching a multi-billion-dollar merger. "We are taking a 10-minute recess," Rhett commanded. He didn't wait for a response. He stood up, walked into the adjacent private antechamber, and dialed 3 numbers in rapid succession. The first call was to the chairman of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, a man whose political campaigns Rhett had heavily financed. The second call was to his lead fixers at Kirkland and Ellis, instructing them to instantly file an emergency federal injunction against the contracted security firm operating at JFK. The third call was to the personal cell phone of the CEO of Global Atlantic Airlines, who was abruptly woken up in his Connecticut mansion. Rhett's message to the CEO was brutally brief. "Your ground staff just assaulted my 17-year-old daughter. Ground the plane, arrest the contractors, and fire the crew, or I will publicly liquidate my firm's 30% stake in your holding company when the markets open tomorrow, and bankrupt your entire operation by noon." Less than 8 minutes after Daniels crushed Cleo's phone, the heavy security doors at the terminal end of the jet bridge burst open. 6 tactical officers from the legitimate Port Authority Police Department, PAPD, flak jackets, assault rifles slung across their chests, and sidearms drawn, swarmed down the narrow slanted tunnel. They moved with terrifying practiced precision. Flanking them was the JFK Terminal 4 duty manager, a man named Preston Reed, who was sweating so profusely his tie was completely soaked through. "PAPD, hands off the girl, step away from her right now," the lead officer, Lieutenant Garza, bellowed, aiming his weapon directly at Daniels' chest. Daniels froze, his hand still gripping Cleo's hoodie. He blinked, completely uncomprehending. Whoa, friendly, we're airport security," he yelled, raising one hand while keeping his other firmly on Cleo. "We detained an unruly—" "I said hands off her," Garza roared, closing the distance in 3 massive strides. He grabbed Daniels by the tactical vest and violently hurled him against the opposite wall of the jet bridge. Before Daniels could even process the assault, 2 PAPD officers slammed him face first into the metal siding, kicking his legs apart and wrenching his arms painfully behind his back. The distinct, sharp click of heavy steel handcuffs echoing in the tunnel was a sound of absolute finality. "What the hell are you doing?" Daniels screamed, his face pressed against the cold wall. She was resisting. "You are under arrest for aggravated assault of a minor, unlawful detention and destruction of property." Garza read off in a breathless rush, pulling Daniels' security badge off his chest and tossing it onto the floor. "You're done, both of you." The younger security officer didn't fight back. He immediately dropped to his knees and laced his fingers behind his head, terrified by the sheer force of the real police. Preston Reed rushed forward, completely bypassing the arrested guards, and knelt beside Cleo. She was trembling violently now, the adrenaline crash hitting her hard, her wrists bruised and turning a mottled purple where Daniels had dug his fingers in. "Miss Mitchell?" Preston asked, his voice shaking with a terror that had nothing to do with the guns and everything to do with his employment status. He hurriedly shrugged off his suit jacket and draped it over her shoulders. "I am so incredibly sorry. I am the duty manager for the terminal. Are you injured? Do you need paramedics?" Cleo pulled the jacket tighter around herself, her breathing ragged, but her eyes remained remarkably clear. She looked at the arrested officer, then at the airplane door. "I want to speak to the flight attendant," she said quietly, "and the woman who took my seat." "Right away," Preston said, standing up. He looked at Lieutenant Garza. "Secure the bridge. I'm going onto the aircraft." Inside the first-class cabin, Beatrice Montgomery had just brought the crystal flute of Dom Perignon to her lips, when the aircraft door, which had been left slightly ajar, was violently thrown completely open. Preston Reed marched into the cabin, followed closely by 2 armed PAPD officers. The sheer presence of real law enforcement immediately sucked the oxygen out of the room. Passengers gasped, shifting in their seats. David Cole leaned forward, a grim smile finally breaking across his face. Preston stopped at the front galley. He locked eyes with Susan, who was holding a bottle of champagne, perfectly frozen in shock. "Susan Higgins," Preston said, his voice carrying the dead weight of corporate execution. "Yes, Mr. Reed. What is happening?" Susan stammered, her professional veneer finally cracking. "Turn over your tablet and your crew badge," Preston ordered loudly, ensuring every passenger in the premium cabin could hear him. "You are suspended immediately, pending a formal termination hearing. You completely bypassed airline protocol, lied to the captain about a weight distribution issue, and facilitated the assault of a VIP passenger due to blatant racial profiling." Susan turned completely white. The champagne bottle slipped from her hands, landing heavily on the galley counter. "No, you don't understand. The passenger in 2A was a squatter. The passenger in 2A is the daughter of our majority shareholder." Preston cut her off, his voice dripping with venom. "Gather your personal belongings and get off this aircraft, now." As Susan began to weep, Preston turned his attention to seat 2A. Beatrice Montgomery was staring at him, her mouth slightly agape, the crystal flute trembling in her manicured hand. "Ma'am," Preston said, stepping right up to her row, "you are currently trespassing in a seat that does not belong to you." Beatrice bristled, her ingrained entitlement fighting through her shock. "Do you know who my husband is?" "I am a Diamond Medallion member. I was feeling unsafe because of that girl's hostile behavior." "I do not care who your husband is," Preston said coldly, gesturing to the two PAPD officers standing behind him. "You initiated a false security claim that resulted in a minor being assaulted. You are in violation of federal aviation laws regarding crew interference. You will gather your items immediately." Beatrice's face morphed from arrogant to indignant, and finally to pure, unfiltered humiliation as she realized the officers were moving toward her. "Where am I supposed to go? Economy?" she demanded shrilly. "No, ma'am," Preston replied, his voice echoing in the dead-silent cabin. "You are being removed from this flight. Furthermore, you are officially permanently banned from Global Atlantic Airlines and all One World Alliance partners. If you do not stand up right now, these officers will remove you in handcuffs. The choice is yours." The command hung in the sterilized, pressurized air of the first-class cabin, absolute and uncompromising. Beatrice Montgomery, a woman whose entire existence had been insulated by extreme wealth and generational privilege, sat paralyzed. The crystal flute in her hand vibrated violently as the reality of the situation breached the thick walls of her entitlement. She was being ordered off a commercial aircraft, threatened with handcuffs by heavily armed Port Authority officers, and publicly banned from an entire global airline network. "You cannot be serious," Beatrice stammered, her voice losing its cultured transatlantic lilt, cracking into a desperate shrill pitch. "My husband is a senior managing director at Goldman Sachs. We have an estate in the Hamptons. You do not speak to me this way. I will have your job for this." Preston Reed, the terminal duty manager, did not flinch. He had just received an encrypted message on his company tablet confirming that the holding company's board of directors was currently convening an emergency midnight session. The only agenda item was the immediate termination of the airport's security contract and the firing of the entire flight crew. Preston knew his own head was on the chopping block. He had no patience left for the arrogant woman who had sparked the inferno. "Ma'am, the man whose daughter you just had physically assaulted manages portfolios that could buy and sell your husband's division before breakfast," Preston stated, his tone devoid of any customer service warmth. "Your status is completely irrelevant. If you do not unbuckle that seatbelt and walk off this aircraft under your own power, these officers will deploy physical force. That is not a threat. It is an imminent procedural fact." Behind Preston, Lieutenant Garza tapped the heavy black tactical flashlight hanging from his belt, a silent, universally understood gesture of impending compliance. The color drained entirely from Beatrice's face, leaving her heavily powdered skin looking like cracked porcelain. The murmurs from the surrounding passengers had grown into a chorus of unconcealed disgust. The businessman across the aisle, David Cole, was openly grinning, the ultimate witness to her public execution. Trembling, Beatrice unfastened her seatbelt. The metallic click sounded like a gunshot in the quiet cabin. She reached up with shaking hands to retrieve her Louis Vuitton carry-on from the overhead bin, but she was so unnerved she dropped it. The leather bag hit the aisle carpet with a heavy thud, spilling a velvet jewelry pouch and a bottle of Xanax onto the floor. No one moved to help her. "Keep moving," one of the PAPD officers instructed coldly, stepping aside to create a narrow path. Beatrice Montgomery began her walk of shame. She stumbled past the galley, refusing to make eye contact with the weeping, disgraced flight attendant, Susan Higgins. As Beatrice stepped out of the aircraft door and onto the jet bridge, the sight that greeted her made her knees buckle. The lead security contractor, Officer Daniels, was pressed face first against the corrugated metal wall, his hands firmly zip-tied behind his back, while another PAPD officer read him his Miranda rights. Daniels was sobbing, the aggressive, power-hungry bully completely broken by the realization that he was facing federal civil rights charges and a mandatory minimum sentence for assaulting a minor under the color of authority. Standing near the entrance of the jet bridge, wrapped in Preston's oversized suit jacket, was the teenage girl Beatrice had tried to banish. The teenager wasn't crying. She stood tall, her posture radiating an eerie, terrifying calm that mirrored the corporate ruthlessness of her billionaire father. Beatrice hurried past her, her head down, fleeing up the ramp toward the terminal. As soon as she reached the concourse, she pulled out her phone and frantically dialed her husband's private number. She needed him to call his lawyers. She needed him to unleash hell on the airline. The phone rang 4 times before he answered. "Henry, you will not believe the absolute nightmare I am enduring," Beatrice began, her voice a hysterical hiss. "Shut up, Beatrice," her husband's voice barked through the receiver. It was a tone he had never directed at her in 30 years of marriage. He sounded breathless, panicked, and entirely broken. "I don't care where you are. Get on a train, get in a car, just get back to the city. We are ruined." Beatrice stopped walking. The bustling noise of Terminal 4 seemed to fade into a dull roar. "What are you talking about? Henry, an airline just threw me off a flight." "An airline is the least of our problems," Henry screamed, his voice echoing with raw desperation. 10 minutes ago, Mitchell Capital initiated a hostile liquidity pull on every single over-leveraged asset my division manages. They triggered margin calls on 3 of our largest international accounts. My firm is bleeding billions as we speak. The board just asked for my resignation to appease them. "We have nothing, Beatrice. The accounts are frozen. The firm's legal team won't even take my calls. Who did you piss off today?" The phone slipped from Beatrice's hand, clattering onto the polished terrazzo floor of the terminal. The screen shattered, much like the teenager's phone had on the plane. The karmic retribution had not just been swift, it was total, surgical, and financially lethal. Back on the cold, brightly lit incline of the jet bridge, the cleanup was ruthlessly, terrifyingly efficient. The swift hand of consequence had arrived, and it was entirely uncompromising. Officer Greg Daniels, the man who had just minutes ago reveled in his unchecked authority, was now experiencing the total collapse of his reality. Pressed face first against the corrugated metal siding of the tunnel, the heavy nylon zip ties bit savagely into his wrists, turning his hands pale. He was hyperventilating, the arrogant flush of his face replaced by the sickly pallid grey of sheer panic. As Lieutenant Garza hauled him upright by the collar of his tactical vest, Daniel's legs betrayed him, wobbling like a newborn fawn's. "Walk," Garza commanded, his voice devoid of any sympathy. "Keep your eyes on the floor." Daniels and his younger, equally terrified partner were escorted up the steep ramp, heavily surrounded by the elite, unyielding presence of the Port Authority Police Department. As they emerged from the jet bridge and breached the public concourse of Terminal 4, the true scale of their humiliation began. Hundreds of delayed passengers, their boredom shattered by the spectacle, had formed a massive perimeter. A sea of smartphones was held aloft, camera lenses unblinking, capturing every agonizing second of the militarized security guards being perp-walked by real law enforcement. The whispers and gasps of the crowd hit Daniels like physical blows. He wasn't just losing his badge, he was becoming the face of a viral catastrophe. Within an hour, that high-definition footage would flood the internet, perfectly syncing with the internal cabin video that David Cole had already securely forwarded to 3 major news networks. The ensuing public explosion would be catastrophic. By the time the sun rose over Manhattan, under immense, unendurable public pressure and the looming shadow of a multi-billion-dollar federal lawsuit from Mitchell Capital, the Port Authority would permanently sever all contracts with the private security provider across JFK, LaGuardia, and Newark airports. Thousands of aggressively undertrained guards would be out of work, and the parent company would be pushed into immediate, unavoidable bankruptcy. Meanwhile, inside the sterile confines of the terminal office, Susan Higgins was experiencing her own total unraveling. Stripped of her iconic airline wings and her digital crew badge, she sat trembling in a plastic chair as a junior terminal manager meticulously boxed up her personal locker. She was being escorted off the property, not just fired, but permanently blacklisted. The 20 years she had dedicated to climbing the seniority ladder, the pension she had banked her retirement on, and the prestigious international routes she cherished were all annihilated in the span of 15 minutes. She wept uncontrollably, the harsh fluorescent lights offering no comfort, as she finally grasped that her willingness to indulge a wealthy woman's prejudice had cost her everything she valued. She would later face a crippling civil suit for defamation and discrimination that would drain whatever savings she had left, leaving her unemployable in the aviation industry for the rest of her life. Down in the jet bridge, the chaos had finally receded, leaving behind a heavy, exhausted silence. Cleo took a deep, shuddering breath, her slender frame leaning against the cool metal wall. The immediate physical danger had passed, but the adrenaline crash was hitting her with the force of a freight train. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably, and beneath the soft cotton of her black hoodie, her wrists throbbed, already turning a mottled, angry purple where Daniels had dug his thick fingers into her skin. "Miss Mitchell," a gentle, tentative voice interrupted the rushing sound in her ears. Cleo looked up. It was the aircraft's captain. He had left the secure sanctuary of the cockpit, his usually authoritative face pale, heavily lined with stress, and deeply apologetic. He didn't approach too closely, instinctively giving her the physical space she desperately needed. "I am profoundly, entirely sorry," the captain said, his voice thick with genuine remorse. "I was fed false, manipulated information by my cabin crew. They claimed you were an undocumented squatter posing a security threat. Had I known the actual truth of what was transpiring, had I known you were a ticketed miner being harassed, I would have intervened personally and thrown them off myself. My first officer and I are entirely at your disposal." Cleo looked at the captain, her sharp eyes studying his expression. She recognized the sincerity in his posture. Growing up around corporate sharks, she knew how to spot a liar, and this man was simply a pilot who had trusted the wrong team. She understood the rigid chain of command in aviation and knew he had been weaponized by the prejudices of his staff. "Thank you, Captain," Cleo said quietly, her voice surprisingly steady despite the tremor in her hands. She slipped Preston Reed's oversized suit jacket off her shoulders, folding it neatly before handing it back to the sweating, deeply relieved terminal manager. "I don't want any more delays. I just want to go to London." "We will not push back until you are safely seated and completely comfortable," the captain assured her, placing a respectful hand over his heart. "We have called in a replacement senior purser, directly from our reserve lounge, specifically to run the first-class cabin tonight. She is one of our absolute best. Please allow us to escort you back on board." When Cleo stepped back through the heavy aircraft doors, the atmosphere in the premium cabin had undergone a seismic shift. The suffocating, hostile tension that had previously choked the air was entirely gone, replaced by a quiet, incredibly respectful deference. As she walked down the narrow, carpeted aisle toward seat 2A, the businessman David Cole stood up from his seat. He didn't offer a hollow apology or attempt to make small talk. He simply met her eyes and gave her a sharp, deeply respectful nod of solidarity. Several other passengers murmured quiet words of support, their previous passivity replaced by a collective desire to make her feel secure. Cleo slid back into the spacious confines of her window seat. The visual of Beatrice Montgomery's entirely empty seat next to her offered a profound, silent testament to the evening's sudden shift in power. The new purser, a warm, highly professional woman with kind eyes and decades of elite experience, immediately approached. Without hovering or being overly intrusive, she offered a steaming, lavender-scented warm towel and a fresh glass bottle of sparkling water, treating Cleo with the precise, effortless dignity she had originally paid for. 10 minutes later, the massive Boeing 777-300ER finally pushed back from the gate. As the aircraft taxied slowly toward the runway, the heavy, dark rain clouds that had battered the airport all evening suddenly broke, revealing a brilliant, sprawling, starry night sky over the illuminated grid of New York City. The powerful GE-90 engines roared to life, pressing Cleo back into her plush seat as the plane lifted off, leaving the tarmac and the trauma firmly on the ground below. When the plane reached its smooth cruising altitude, breaking through the final layer of turbulence into the quiet, starlit stratosphere, the purser approached Cleo's suite, holding a sleek, heavy satellite phone directly from the cockpit. "It's a highly secure line, miss," the purser said softly, offering a reassuring, motherly smile. "Your father is waiting." Cleo took the heavy device, pressing it to her ear. The ambient hum of the cabin seemed to fade away. "Dad? Are you all right?" Rhett's voice was no longer the icy, terrifying blade that had sliced through the security guard's arrogance. It was warm, heavy with a profound relief, and filled with a fierce, unconditional, protective love. "I'm okay, Dad. I'm safe," Cleo whispered, turning her head to look out the small oval window at the endless dark expanse of the Atlantic Ocean stretching out below them. "Thank you." "Nobody touches you," Rhett stated simply. It wasn't a boast, it was an ironclad promise that he had just proven he could enforce with the crushing weight of the global economy. "Get some sleep. My personal detail will be waiting for you the second you step off the plane at Heathrow. We'll handle the rest of the fallout tomorrow." Cleo handed the satellite phone back to the purser, pressed the button to recline her seat into a fully flat bed, and pulled the heavy duvet up to her chin. As she finally closed her eyes, the rhythmic hum of the engines lulled her into a deep sleep. The justice had been brutal, swift, and absolute. The harrowing events aboard Flight 412 served as a stark, unforgiving reminder that prejudice and unchecked authority are incredibly perilous gambles. When Beatrice's ingrained, arrogant bias collided with Susan's fragile ego and Daniel's aggressive, militarized power trip, they collectively believed they were silencing a young, powerless target who didn't belong in their exclusive world. Instead, they foolishly awakened a sleeping Leviathan. Karma, in this specific instance, was not some mystical, invisible force of the universe taking its time to balance the scales. It was a highly orchestrated, financial and legal annihilation executed flawlessly by a father protecting his blood. The real-life consequences, federal arrests, shattered lifelong careers, and total unrecoverable financial ruin, demonstrated a terrifying modern truth. True power doesn't need to yell, and it doesn't need to throw a punch. It merely makes a single phone call. The perpetrators learned entirely too late that the world is no longer insulated for those who comfortably abuse their privilege, and the resulting downfall was a flawless, devastating masterpiece of absolute retribution.